Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Suzanne Harris, and on our podcast, we not only talk to the authors about themselves and their books, but we also talk to them about their ideas. I'm going to introduce you to such a fascinating person. His name is Peter Massam, and he's going to talk about a trilogy that's called the Learning Experience Trilogy. The 3 books are, book 1 is Nipper, book 2 is Moose Conquering Fear, and book 3 is Know Your Mind, and it was just published this year. Peter, I can't wait to talk to you. Welcome to Books on Air. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
You know, as I was doing my homework, looking at all the information that I found about you, there were several things that just really stood out for me, and I'm very, very curious. I know that your first work that you published was a couple of volumes of poetry. I am always intrigued by poets. How old were you when you first started writing poetry, and what attracted you to poetry?
That's a very good question. I suppose I had a very influential English master. I'm sure many writers would probably say the same thing, who was very inspiring, very open to all forms of communication in literature and poetry. And it's from that starting point that you have an appreciation for all things. It's a bit like musical tastes. If somebody said to me, "Well, what music do you like to hear?" I'd say, "Well, there's a variety of them. I don't exclude any of them, whether it be jazz or pop or whatever. There's room for everyone and everything, every way of conveying a message or getting your points across." And poetry is one such. And although some may dismiss it as, maybe it's too obscure, it probably comes down to the fact that the introduction that's been made to them, their first poem that they ever read, may not have been the correct one, or the one that's, the least obscure. I do actually make a point in the preface to the first book about one of the things that put me off reading, not for life, thankfully, but initially, was being given A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And I never got past the first 2 pages. And as a 10-year-old, I think I was at the time, I was extremely unimpressed by reading. So it wasn't the best of starts, but when I became, 14, 15, there was a book which took my interest. It was, I think, a book of the supernatural, of all things, and that's where the English master picked up from, and he was very encouraging. I didn't write any poetry at that point, because that was your question, was when did I first start? But he gave me a love of English, and that really never left me. I love the language. I love languages. I'm first and foremost a linguist. Studied French and Russian at university. And I just love the different expressions. I love the flexibility that you have to introduce foreign phrases into your language, because you can't say it better than they can. And that's always a wonder and a marvel to me, is finding and going to different places and cultures and discovering new phrases, and you think, that's a really good way of putting it. The last one being Chinese. There are crossovers with English, believe it or not. In some of the phrases that we use, they come directly from Chinese. To go back to your question of when did I start writing poetry, I would have to say it was in France. when I spent my third year of university doing work experience in France for a year. And that's when I start. It would have been well after the 3 months that you need to become fluent in the language, and not just fluent, but also the big sign is if you dream in the language, you know that you got there. And after that arrived, and I became more outgoing because I could communicate better with everybody around me. I found myself in a situation where I wanted to write, and the language that came more naturally to me was French.
How
so
interesting.
That was my first attempt.
How interesting.
It wasn't in my native language.
Not my expectation at all.
No. Well, it kind of surprised me, but because I don't know. I think I was more familiar with what I wanted to say, and it just made sense to do it in that language. And I didn't try and translate it into English because that wouldn't have worked either.
Well, I have to explore here one thing, because you said this as we were offline just chatting. You talked about the fact that you needed to do an audible with your poetry. Tell me a little bit about that. Did you read the poetry yourself for the Audible book that's online for your poetry? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. For one of the shorter book of poems that I did, the sketch poems, I think they were called. And the reason that I wanted to do an audible was that when I read other people's poetry from centuries ago, I always wondered what it would have sounded like coming out of their own mouths. And it also occurred to me that the meaning and the intonation that you put when you're reading poetry is important, because you're conveying the intent of the poetry better than probably any other person reading it. Because obviously you could take, another person, a professional who would read the poetry for Audible, and you pay them to do that, but it wouldn't convey the essence of what I wanted to get across in the poem that I'd written.
Can you hear me nodding my head?
No. But it seemed to me, and I always put myself in a position of, say, elderly folks who are unable to read. Perhaps their vision isn't as good as it used to be, who are more reliant on the spoken word, and podcasts such as this one. And I just thought that it would have more resonance for them if they didn't just sit down and read it themselves, but actually took in the intonation, as I said before, and the accent, and which bits are accentuated and more than others. It was just something that I wanted to do. It was also actually towards, I think it was the beginning of it was after I'd finished my sort of final work and just before the pandemic. And I'd had a summer of thinking, just because I finished work, it means I don't want to not stop learning, because all through my career I've been, learning every day. So I thought, well, what kind of challenge can I set myself which I can do myself? And I thought, well, I might as well do a recording and learn as much as I can about the whole editing process, audio editing.
Interesting.
And that was over a matter of probably 4 months, and I probably went through 8 versions of it before I got to the final version. And one of the experiences was, initially you think, oh, I can do this all myself, so I'll find a nice quiet part of the house in which to sit.
Right.
And, you make your first recording and then you listen back and you've got all the crackling coming from the computer processor. You've got the traffic on the outside, which you thought, well, I can't hear it. I've got I had triple glazed windows, which kept the sound out. But when they're recording, they're all there. So there's no such thing as what do they call it? It's not white space. It's the no sound space that you have at the beginning and the ends of sentences that you're recording.
Something you never thought about before, right?
I didn't know how much noise there is.
Yes.
Ambient noise in any room.
Yes.
And it didn't matter where I was in the house and how quiet I thought it was. And I had an outdoor study as well, where I thought this is it, but it wasn't.
No.
And ultimately, I had to go and worked with go to a professional studio in Oxford, and worked with them. And it didn't take very long at all, and didn't cost very much either, I might say, as well, to get not a clean version, because you still have to do some editing afterwards to make sure that it's crisp and clean before submitting it. So, that was the reason for doing that.
The reason that I wanted us to talk about that is, and I've told you this already, your prose is beautiful. Your prose is beautiful because I think you have not only that you articulate and intelligent, but you have the poet's ear. And so when you write, your writing flows. Your writing is the kind of writing, this is the way that I describe. I don't read very many authors' work that fall into what I'm about to say. It's as if I put my toe in a flowing stream as I start to read your work. The more that I read, all of a sudden I feel I'm up to my ankle in the flowing stream, and then up to my knee, and then I'm flowing down the stream of your words. And that is a very unique thing for me to say about an author's work. And I'm perfectly convinced that a poet's ear influences the writing of fiction, and yours is really, really beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about the books. Now, you made 3 books: Nipper, Moose Conquering Fear, and Know Your Mind. Why 3 books? Why a trilogy that you call a learning experience trilogy?
Well, I never expected to write less. This was always going to be the start of a concept, and that concept came to me over a period of time, really a period of years, kick-started by certain things which happened to me, and I thought, well, for example, I'll give just one example that I quote in the preface to the last book, which is, there were a series of programs that were aired on the BBC about families, and they went back every decade to see what had changed with those families. And that, for me, was interesting, because they looked at physical developments, of course, behavioural changes and all that kind of thing. And it was a fairly heady mix. But what I wanted to do was really look at one individual rather than many families over time. And of course I began with my own experience, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. And I wanted to track not just the experience, which would have given rise to the thought that, well, this is perhaps just a normal account of, coming of age to adulthood and beyond, and turned it into looking at how your mind, which filters things in life, in the physical world, every moment of the day. So there are things that, for example, you might want to say, but you don't. You keep them to yourself.
Right.
Because it would embarrass the others that are around you. And the more I thought about it, I thought, well, yes, I can still go through that learning journey, if you like, of life, but concentrate on the mind's evolution over time. So when you're young, it's looking at not just the good and the bad things that happen to you, but also the beliefs that you formulate as a youngster. So you might absorb the beliefs of your parents initially, and those that teach you. But then the independent streak comes out fairly soon, and you realise that actually this is a journey that only you can fulfil. Nobody else is going to do this for you. And that realisation then kicks in big time when you go out to move on from university or from training as a profession to adult life, where it seems as though a lot of your principles become eroded because of the stress. Some of those beliefs that you originally had are dismantled, and you are having to cope with some very strange and new either challenges or dilemmas, or you're facing up to responsibilities, as we all have done and do in adult life. And I was thinking, well, it's not just enough to quantify what these things were, but it's also to equip people with strategies to cope with those things. And the second book really hinges around that word fear, because we carry over fears from our childhood days, and I might detail those in the first book and carry them on in the second as to how I dealt with them. But there are also fears as you go through relationships and that kind of thing, which you need a strategy to cope with. And one of the things, the second book is probably bleaker in a way, because there are some fairly stressful circumstances. And what was in my mind there was I need to provide people, and young people in particular, with ways of coping. And this is not just because of the pandemic, when mental health became a big, it was exposed for what but it had always been there. And what I'd experienced before was actually through my children, who are now young adults, who, when they were both in their 17 and 18-year-old, at that age group, in what we call here the sixth form, they both had experiences of one of their peers committing suicide.
Oh, dear.
And I had experienced that myself as a teacher with somebody who went to a very good senior school in the private sector doing the same thing. And I thought at that time, all those years ago, I thought, what a waste. This person had everything and going for them, and it was brought to a close. And I thought, there must be something that I can, do to help people who are who feel they have no other course of action. So I thought, well, and the way I put it forward was that you can use the strength of your mind to overcome these difficulties and ease those fears, so that you can calm those troubled waters when they come upon you. And then the third book is a different part of that journey, because, as you will see from the bibliography, it's a much more academically focused philosophy. In other words, out of all this journey that I hopefully take the reader on, there are things to be learned, yes, but you can emerge from it with a new philosophy of how your mind fits in around your physical world and how it can, more importantly, how it can influence the world around you and your communication with other people. And one of the things that I talk about in the third book is actually looking at the evolution of language. So, if you go back to, I forget what the film is now, so many million years BC, it's full of grunts and groans and that sort of thing. And you think, well, yes, you take it at face value and you think, well, we don't really know, do we?
Exactly.
Before words existed, we don't know what happened. And but I had to do a lot of research for that third book, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the evolutionary part of it, I thought, well, there are things that I've discovered through a very sort of not regimental, but a very methodical way of analysing experiences that I've had and trying different things and trying to isolate them. So that, in a very scientific way, that I thought, well, maybe this is how we first communicated, when we didn't have language. And in order to do that, as I said, I had to refer to some of the leading experts in their field to do with the entire history of mankind, how they've evolved, how philosophy has evolved, how evolution has evolved, and those people, are icons of mine in terms of they've taken the trouble to put these things down. And if I've actually recommended some of these books on the Balboa Press website, because you can do that now. It's something which I think everybody can learn from. So, things like Life on Earth by Attenborough, Harari's Sapiens, which looks at the whole evolution of mankind, up as far as Hawking and his Brief History of Time, to understand scientific evolution, through to the great philosopher Bertrand Russell and his Western philosophy compendium of how philosophy has evolved and the problems with it, and how the scientific community sort of diverged, if you like, from what used to be considered an overarching view of man's place in the universe.
As you wrote the books, did you see the audience for each book as a different age group? For example, Nipper is the first book. Who's the audience? Who were you thinking about when you wrote Nipper? And is George you, by the way? George is the main character.
Well, the content is certainly biographical, yes. And I have to rely on my own experience, especially towards in the second and the third books, to bring to fruition, if you like, what that journey has meant. And to answer your question, the first book I wrote deliberately for the younger age group. So I tried, and I don't know whether I succeeded, but I tried to make the language simpler, especially in the initial chapters, because I would hope that, a person of 11 or 12 could pick up the book and not find it difficult to read. But it then, as you go through the chapters, it appeals probably more to the teenage year group, if you like, that they can resonate perhaps more with the things that are being felt there and the challenges that they face. But it should nonetheless be appealing to an older audience who just like reading, the passage of time from a young age and reminiscences, because most people have reminiscences of sorts during their time, and just see it as a starting point, really.
Oh, the story with the squeeze bottles. I sat there and I read it and I started to laugh because you're absolutely right. I think every one of us, as we read that story about what the two kids were doing with these squeeze bottles and what happened, we've all done something. And perhaps we got caught, perhaps we didn't, but we've all done something that in the midst of it we thought, uh-oh. I was right there in that village with those two boys, and I thought that was wonderful. That was the way that you paint the picture. Once again, it's that poetic influence, the way that you paint the picture of what's happening. I really enjoyed that, and I think anyone would enjoy that. And as a former teacher myself, you and I both have taught. I kept thinking about things that would be useful, and I thought, this is a book that parents could use, even with children, to read your language aloud would be wonderful for a child, and a child would have to sit there and laugh at the antics of George. I mean, he's such a wonderful character. And then the second book, Moose Conquering Fear, the cover immediately caught my attention because you have a young boy standing on a promontory of rock looking down at the fin of a giant shark. And if that doesn't get across what's happening in that book, I can't imagine. I really, really think what you've done is so interesting with this trilogy.
I hope that it appeals to, it's always been a desire. 'Cause I have worked, in my latter years in my career, I have liaised with the Leeds University Business School to help their students that are studying for master's degrees in international business, to make their work relevant and to appeal to that kind of audience, or any sort of audience, really. And as you say, if I can get these onto shelves so that people have access to them, like my local library, for example, I've donated all my books to them because I want people to be able to access them who otherwise might not be able to afford them. Then I'd hope that they could be a resource, if you like. So one thing which has permeated through almost solidly throughout my business career is that when I create something, one person asked me once, they said, that presentation you did, that's really good, but I expect you'll be updating it next year, won't you? And I went, no, I won't be updating it, no. Maybe right at the very beginning, if the marketing material has changed, I might do it, but otherwise, no. When I write something, I write it with longevity in mind. I want it to last. So everything that's in there can be relevant to any person reading it, not just now. So it's not sort of hinged, or it's not constrained by the time that we're living in now, in the 21st century, but in the 22nd century and the 23rd century, you want people to be, they'll probably be feeling the same things and can resonate with what you've written. That was the intention as well.
Let's share a little bit of Book 3, Know Your Mind. I believe that you have a reading that you'd like to share with the listener so they can hear how the book sounds.
Yes, I do. My choice is probably a little unusual in that I'm not going to read from the text itself. I'm going to read from the epilogue. And the reason I want to read this to your audience here is because it's part of the takeaway, or part of the reasons that I've put this trilogy together, and what I want people to do as a result of it. Because as in business, you're always looking for the next steps, and there are more than one step that we that I can take after this, and I'm already reaching out to people to try and take those next steps. But this is for the ordinary reader, and what I'd like to for them to, not to change the way they do things, but just to have that openness in mind. So, yes, if you're ready, I will read you the epilogue, and it's mercifully short.
Please.
Okay. So it relates to a trip that I made to, several trips that I made to Melbourne in Australia. I had the good fortune to travel to Melbourne in Australia a couple of times. If asked to name 3 things which made an impression on me there, they would have to be the following. Firstly, the Yarra Yarra River that dominates the downtown central business district and provides the backdrop for nightly celebrations with jets of fire scorching the sky at sunset. The second would be the overriding feeling of contentment walking to work up the hill from the river. I wondered at first why this was such a pleasant experience, but quickly discovered the source in the faces of those around me and in their relaxed gait. On the sparsely populated pavements, their smiles shone out, reflected in the sparkling office windows on another fine day. Their calm, unhurried pace conveyed a state of being at one with their world. And then thirdly, further up that hill, where light traffic enters your field of vision, a curiosity meets the eye. Cars pulling off to the left at a crossroads in order to make a right turn, known to me as a J-turn, but by others perhaps as a hook turn. It was not so much the practicality of avoiding tram lines going down the centre of the road which made an impact on me, but the complementary nature of their rallentando approach to the junction that seemed to be in perfect harmony with the pedestrians walking alongside them. Just as pulling over out of the flow of bi-directional traffic lanes to make a J-turn is deliberate, so stepping out of the mainstream is a conscious move. When considering the workings of the mind, I feel we have to make a similar J-turn. The physical world continues to hasten by at variable and sometimes blistering speeds. But stepping out of that zone and parking the stresses of our complex lives can allow our mind to fill the void, bring balance to our well-being, and connect better with each other.
I love it. The visual language, the imagery. Did the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce I'll pay you for that? It's lovely. It makes me immediately want to see what you just talked about and feel what you just felt. I love that.
Can I just state for the record?
You may, Peter.
There is no money exchanged hands as a result of any of what I've written or said.
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. It's just so lovely and complimentary about Melbourne. Immediately, you've always heard things about the Aussies, and to hear that kind of comment just reinforces the image that I've always had of Australia itself and about the Australian people. I've just always thought that they were so calm and so laid back, and their environment is so lovely and so beautiful. I thought you captured that wonderfully. I was only teasing about the Chamber of Commerce. Surely they knew.
Well, without sort of putting a dampener on it, and the Australians themselves, and I'm very familiar with that because a quarter, well, roughly a half actually of my grandparents' side were Australian, and I'm about a quarter Australian, I think. If you ask them about Melbourne, especially if they're not from Melbourne, they will just say one thing about it, which is, well, if you're not happy with the weather in Melbourne, just wait 5 minutes.
I see.
Because you can have 4 seasons in one day down there, and that is true. But at the same time, it is a lovely, relaxed atmosphere. And having been to Sydney as well, I must admit I did like the calmness of that city. It is
Well, this has been delightful. Our time is nearing an end, and I just have one more thing that I want to ask, and that is, when our listeners become readers and they pick up a copy of all 3 books and they read Nipper and they read Moose Conquering Fear and they read Know Your Mind and they come to the very last page of the 3rd book for the very last time and they're about to close the back cover of that book, what is the bottom line message? What is the takeaway for the reader that you would like them to leave with from the trilogy?
I would like any reader of these books to leave with an open mind. An open mind that things can be different, that perspectives on this life can be changed or altered, and also that it doesn't matter what challenges are thrown at you, and some can be pretty mean, that there are ways of coping with these things, and that the mind is definitely the best tool for doing that.
I know that we have not told them yet where to find the book, so this is a perfect opportunity to do that, and it is on all 3 books. I actually have looked and know all 3 books are on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon, there's a little drop-down menu in the left-hand column, select books, and then put in the title of the book. Now let me give you the last book, which was new this year, 2023. It's Know Your Mind by Peter, Peter, Massam, Massam. You can also find Moose Conquering Fear, also written by Peter Massam, and Nipper, also by Peter Massam. Those are the 3 books that make up the trilogy. They're all on Amazon, and when you go to Amazon to look at the book, there's a brief description, and also up in the upper right-hand corner of the representation of the cover is a phrase that says "Open Here." If you put your cursor on that phrase and just click on it, the book will electronically open, and you'll be able to read an excerpt from the book itself. Now, Peter, I know that Amazon is the largest bookseller in the world, I'm sure. And I know that there are people in our audience who would like to buy their books from Amazon, but then there are others who would like to buy from a smaller source. Are there some other places that they could pick up a copy of any of these 3 books and the books of poetry that you've written?
Yes, there is. Or I should say there are. I hope that there are 2 places really. One is the publisher for this trilogy, which is Balboa Press, and that can be accessed as a .com or in the UK. And the other thing to know is that these books are also available through the major wholesalers, one of which is Gardner's. And Gardner's are a huge supplier of people, of bookstores, independents, libraries here as well. So, if you just wanted a copy, you could go to, without paying anything, you could go to a local library and ask them for it, and they should be able to get hold of it for you. Otherwise, if you'd like your own copy to read, in soft hardback or in Kindle version, yes, you can buy those from independent bookstores as well as from Balboa Press.
It has been such a delight to meet you and talk with you. There are so many other topics that you and I could have touched on. We could be talking for at least an hour. It's just such a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today and with our listeners on Books on Air.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you for taking the time, and your listeners too.
Now, don't forget, you can find any of Peter Massam's work on Amazon and Balboa Press. Now, you've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also listen to this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Apple Podcast. I'm Suzanne Harris, and I so hope that you'll join me for our next Books on Air podcast, because remember, you never know who's going to be here, and you never know what we're going to talk about. Thank you so very much for listening.